Years ago, on the 15th of August 1945, the Empire of Japan finally surrendered after 3.5 years of the most appalling warfare against the Allies.
Harry S. Truman, 4 months after taking oath as president, leads his country finally to victory and peace.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment.
But not all Japanese soldiers gave up the fight. As all across the Pacific, Japanese soldiers, some in small groups under the command of officers, others alone, either never heard of Japan's surrender, or if they did, believed it to be a trick of the Western Allies and refused to surrender. Astonishingly, these men went into hiding, eking out a desperate existence in jungle hideouts and caves, and in some cases they continued to fight against U.S. occupation forces and later against the armies and police forces of post-war nations. The last surrender of Japanese troops occurred not in 1945, but 29 years later in 1974. Here are 4 of the most notorious examples. In June 1944, Saipan, occupied by the Japanese, was invaded by the United States Marine Corps. The Japanese were gradually pushed into its interior, and relief being impossible, and with supplies almost exhausted, the commander of the Japanese forces ordered a final banzai charge. Among the 6,000 men who charged the Americans was Captain Sakei Oba. He commanded a mixed medical company numbering 225 men. It was the largest banzai charge of World War II, and 4,300 Japanese were killed. Oba survived the charge and took command of 46 soldiers and headed deep into the jungles. Oba continued to battle American forces. His group was the last remaining combatant forces on the island of Saipan. Oba led his men in constant raids against the U.S. post-war garrison, leading to his nickname of the Fox for his stealthy commando-like raids on U.S. positions. Captain Oba and his men held out for 512 days until the 1st of December 1945. That was 3 months after Japan's final surrender. Oba finally surrendered after order to do so by a captured Japanese major general. Oba's men paraded and formally surrendered their rifles and regimental colors. Oba then surrendered his own sword to the senior U.S. officer. Interestingly, some 40 years after the surrender, Oba's sword was returned to him by the U.S. officer that had taken it. Oba and his men returned to Japan. Oba himself became a successful businessman and a local politician and died in 1992 at the age of 78. Oba wasn't the only Japanese officer to lead soldiers in continuing armed resistance against U.S. occupation forces after the surrender. Lieutenant E. Yamaguchi, a platoon commander in the Japanese 2nd Infantry Regiment, had served for several years in China as an ordinary soldier before being commissioned and sent with his regiment to the Pacific island of Peleliu. Between the 15th of September and the 27th of November 1944, U.S. forces fought a ferocious battle to take this small coral island and its strategically important airfield. 47,500 U.S. Marines and soldiers fought against over 12,000 Japanese troops. Almost the entire Japanese garrison were killed, and a small handful were taken prisoner. Lieutenant Yamaguchi, however, was not among these two categories. At the end of the battle, he led 32 Japanese soldiers into hiding. But Yamaguchi didn't just hide. He led attacks on the small marine garrison force which numbered just 150 men after the war, who were stationed on the island. On one occasion, he and his men ambushed an American patrol using hand grenades. Yamaguchi was a hard nut. He tolerated no talk of surrender among his group. Indeed, it is alleged that he shot one of his own men who attempted to surrender. Many believe that Yamaguchi thought the war wasn't over, so surrender was not an option. However, the continual small attacks on the U.S. garrison up to early 1947 led the U.S. to send in reinforcements. An American patrol, accompanied by a former wartime Japanese admiral, was sent to try and persuade Yamaguchi to give up. Finally, in late April 1947, Yamaguchi and his men emerged from the jungle and surrendered. The Japanese officer handing over his sword to the senior Marine Corps officer present, and also surrendering the battle flag of his unit. Interestingly, in 1994, Yamaguchi returned to Peleliu and was filmed visiting his former positions, the interviewer noting that Yamaguchi had lost none of his ferocious disposition. Quote, "During my personal talk with him on the island, he had a look that sent chills down your spine." End quote. Some Japanese soldiers had different experiences as holdouts. Born in 1915, Shuichi Yokoi was an apprentice tailor when conscripted in 1941. He first served with the 29th Infantry Division in Manchukuo, the puppet Japanese state in northern China, until he was transferred to the island of Guam in February 1943. In 1944, U.S. forces invaded Guam, and Sergeant Yokoi's regiment, the 38th Infantry, was destroyed in the subsequent fighting. The survivors dispersed into the island's interior. And Yokoi initially hid out with 9 other Japanese soldiers. After some years, 7 of the 10 men moved away. These men later being captured, with Yokoi and 2 others remaining in the region. The men lived separately, but they often visited each other. Sergeant Yokoi constructed for himself a small underground bunker to live in. In 1964, Yokoi's 2 Japanese comrades drowned in a flood, leaving the sergeant all alone. For another 8 years, he subsisted by himself, living in his cave, making his own clothing, bedding, and household goods. When his wartime uniform wore out, Yokoi, using his pre-war tailoring skills, constructed another for himself, using tree bark and other materials. On the 24th of January 1972, 2 local men checking fishing nets along the Talofofo River ran into Yokoi. Fearing for his life, the sergeant attacked the men, but he was overpowered and taken to a police station. Yokoi admitted that he had known that the war had been over since about 1952, but had feared coming out of the jungle to surrender. In his cave, police discovered an Arasaka Type 99 rifle in full working order, some ammunition, a single live hand grenade, and a Japanese flag. He said famously, quote, "We Japanese soldiers were told to prefer death to the disgrace of getting captured alive." And on returning to Japan, he remarked, "It is with much embarrassment that I return." End quote. He nevertheless became something of a celebrity in early 1970s Japan. In total, he'd held out for 28 years. Sergeant Shuichi Yokoi died in 1997, at the age of 82. But perhaps the most notorious example is the officer who held out for the longest of all. Born in 1922 to an ancient samurai family, Hiro Onada's father was killed in action in China in 1943. At 18, Onada enlisted in the army. Trained as an intelligence officer, on the 26th of December 1944, Second Lieutenant Onada arrived on the Philippine island of Lubang. His job was to do everything possible to hinder an American attack, including destroying the local airstrip and the harbor pier. His orders were explicit: do not surrender and do not take your own life if the island falls. On the 28th of February 1945, U.S. forces indeed landed and quickly captured Lubang. True to his orders, Onoda took his remaining 3 men into the hills, planning a guerrilla campaign. His companions were Private Akatsu, Private First Class Kozuka, and Corporal Shimada. Onoda's small unit moved around the jungle and cave systems on the island, never camping for too long in the same place. In October 1945, Onoda's men found a leaflet telling them that Japan had surrendered. Onoda believed it was an enemy ruse. Later, another leaflet was found, which read, quote, "The war ended on August 15th. Come down from the mountains." End quote. All subsequently discovered leaflets were ignored on Onoda's order. Onoda's guerrilla campaign included raiding local Filipino villages for food and supplies, burning their rice stocks, and occasionally killing and injuring locals. They were actively hunted by both the Philippines police and army and by the U.S. Army. In September 1949, Private Akatsu, disillusioned by Onoda's strict leadership, left the group and for 6 months survived alone in the jungle, later surrendering to Filipino forces. In a shootout with local fishermen in June 1953, Corporal Shimada was wounded in the leg. The 2 other Japanese nursed him back to health in their forest hideout. On the 7th of May 1954, Shimada was shot and killed by police who were searching for Japanese holdouts. This pattern of raiding and shootouts dragged on for a further 18 years until on the 9th of October 1972, local police shot and killed Private First Class Kozuka. Lieutenant Onoda was now alone, but determined to continue with his mission. The issue was eventually resolved by an enterprising young Japanese by the name of Norio Suzuki, who had set off on a world trip seeking Lieutenant Onoda, the Wild Panda, and the Abominable Snowman in that order. It took Suzuki just 4 days to establish contact with Onoda. He did this by camping in the area where Onoda was known to operate and playing wartime Japanese songs on a tape recorder. Onoda said that he was waiting for orders from a superior officer, and he would refuse to surrender until such orders arrived. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of himself and Onoda as proof of their encounter. The Japanese government located Onoda's former commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, and together with officials, the major traveled to Lubang and presented Onoda with a written order relieving him of his duties, and he therefore surrendered. He turned over his sword, 2 functioning Arasaka rifles, 500 rounds of ammunition, and several hand grenades. Lieutenant Onoda had held out in the jungles of Lubang for an incredible 29 years. He died in Japan on the 16th of January 2014 at the age of 91. At this point, I must add a footnote to the story of Japanese holdouts. After the surrender of Lieutenant Onoda in March 1974, 1 more Japanese soldier was found alive and in hiding. Although this man, named Teruo Nakamura, was in Japanese uniform, he wasn't actually Japanese. Instead, he was an Amis Aborigine from the Japanese colony of Formosa, now Taiwan. The Japanese conscripted local indigenous men into a unit called the Takasago Volunteers. The Japanese used these men because they believed they would be useful to special forces operations due to the indigenous people's skills in the jungles of Taiwan. Under attached Japanese officers, such units were used as frontline troops, and Nakamura, real name Atun Palalin, born in 1919, ended up on the Indonesian island of Morotai. When the Allies recaptured the Dutch East Indies, Nakamura was one of many Japanese and Formosan troops who hid out in the island's mountainous jungle-covered interior. In 1956, Private Nakamura moved away from other stragglers and eventually built a small wooden hut for himself to live in and fenced off a field around it to grow vegetables. He was found completely by chance in mid-1974 by an Indonesian Air Force plane which spotted Nakamura's hut. Indonesian soldiers eventually arrived at his camp and he was arrested on the 18th of December 1974, 30 years after he had arrived on Morotai. He still had a functioning Arasaka rifle and 5 rounds of ammunition. Nakamura asked to be repatriated to Taiwan and not Japan. He received his back pay from the Japanese military and a small gift to help him settle, but received a difficult reception in Taiwan, seen by many as a traitor who had served the hated Japanese. Eventually, following an outcry in Japan, Nakamura received a substantial payment from the government and from public donations. He died just 5 years after repatriation in June 1979 at the age of 59. And finally, there is one more that we knew existed but was never found. Japanese Army Captain Fumio Nakahara had escaped into the interior of the Philippine island of Mindoro in 1945 following the Allied victory there. Reports of his continued existence went on for decades, and in 1980 a Japanese search team that included a former colleague of Nakahara's searched Mindoro for him. They never found the captain, but they did discover a hut that he had built and some of his equipment, leading them to believe that he had been alive recently. His body was never found, but the fact that in 1980 credible evidence existed of a Japanese holdout 35 years after VJ Day was in itself amazing. Of course, I have not been able to cover all the stories of Japanese holdouts since 1945. They are numerous. Also, some stragglers may have indeed lasted longer than 1980. It seems likely. Stories are legion across the Pacific of old Japanese soldiers in the jungles and mountains. It's entered the local folklore. Whether any of them are still alive 80 years after the end of the Second World War seems unlikely. But then again, you never know. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.